I thought I was being the boyfriend of the year by booking my girlfriend a luxury spa day, but I didn't realize I was actually paying a mysterious organization $450 to systematically erase the woman I loved. It all started during the peak of the holiday rush, when the retail industry was draining the life out of her, leaving her a hollow shell of herself, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, coming home with aching feet and a soul crushed by the weight of corporate greed. In my silly boyfriend mind, as she called it, I thought a high-end experience would be the cure, so I bypassed the cheap, sketchy parlors for a place called Sudan Tide, a website that looked more like a cult than a business, with its black backdrop and promises of removing darkness from the soul. But the true nightmare began before I even booked the appointment. When I called the number, a woman with a voice like ice greeted me by my full name, Donovan, despite me never having shared it, and casually mentioned they were open on Christmas Day for the premium package. I was so distracted by my girlfriend's sobbing arrival at the door that I ignored the chilling fact that they had already tracked my IP address and personal info. After comforting her and promising that her retail days were over, I sat down at my computer only to find my bank account had been drained of $481.50 without me ever providing a card number. I tried to call them back, desperate for an explanation, but the line was dead, and as I looked at the digital receipt, a feeling of pure dread washed over me because I realized I hadn't just booked a massage, I had invited something predatory into our lives. The morning of Christmas was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives, but I woke up to a house so quiet it felt like a tomb, only to realize that the perfect gift I'd bought was actually a contract for my girlfriend's kidnapping. I had fallen into a deep, heavy sleep on Christmas Eve, the kind of sleep where you feel safe because the person you love is right beside you. But when my hand reached out in the early morning light, the sheets were cold and empty. I bolted upright, my eyes landing on a single clinical note resting on her pillow that claimed she'd been called into work for an emergency holiday shift. But the moment I read those words, a paralyzing chill raced down my spine. Her store was locked tight for the holiday, and there was no way in hell she would have vanished without a kiss goodbye. I launched out of bed, my voice cracking as I screamed her name through the hallways, but the only response was the mocking silence of our decorated home. When I reached the living room, my heart stopped. The front door hadn't just been opened, it had been violently forced, the wood splintered and the heavy brass handle hanging from the socket by a single mangled screw. This wasn't a robbery. Every expensive gift, every piece of jewelry, and all my tech sat completely untouched under the glowing lights of the tree. It was a surgical extraction of a human being. I dialed 911 with thumbs that wouldn't stop shaking, sobbing as I told the operator my girlfriend was missing and my home had been breached, but the response was a soul-crushing wave of indifference. Because we were both adults and there was no blood at the scene, the police told me I had to wait 24 to 48 hours before they would even consider opening a case, essentially telling me to wait while her trail went cold. Just as I was about to collapse from the sheer weight of the panic, my phone chimed with a notification that felt like a direct threat from the shadows, a simple, automated reminder for her 7 p.m. appointment at Sudan Tide. It hit me then with sickening, visceral clarity that this spa didn't wait for their clients to arrive. They came to collect them like property. And as I scrambled to my computer to find an address, I realized the website had been scrubbed from the internet entirely, leaving me staring at a dead gray 404 error page. I was trapped in a nightmare where the kidnappers had my money, my address, and my girlfriend, and the world was telling me to just sit back and wait for the session to end. The police didn't just fail to find my missing girlfriend, they occupied my house like a hotel, eating my food and mocking my desperation while she was being subjected to a treatment I had accidentally funded. Those next 24 hours were a descent into a living hell, a period where time seemed to stretch and warp until every tick of the clock felt like a hammer blow against my skull. I was trapped in a festive prison, surrounded by shimmering tinsel and colorful lights that now felt like a cruel joke, staring at the jagged, splintered wood of my front door that stood as a violent reminder of how easily they had taken her. When the authorities finally deigned to show up, they didn't bring the urgency of a rescue mission. Instead, they brought a cold, dismissive arrogance that made my blood boil. They stomped through my home with muddy boots, peering into our private lives with bored expressions, and even had the audacity to suggest that my girlfriend hadn't been kidnapped at all, but simply grown tired of the stress and walked on me. But the ultimate insult came when I watched one of the officers casually open my refrigerator, grab a soda, and crack it open while standing right over the spot where her heels had been tossed aside during her abduction. They rummaged through her dresser, throwing her clothes around like they were searching for drugs rather than a human being, all while I sat on the edge of the sofa trembling with a mix of fury and absolute terror. I handed over my laptop, pleading with them to trace the digital footprint of Sur and Tide to find the ghost who had drained $481.50 from my account without a card number. But the detectives just exchanged skeptical glances. To them, I was just a hysterical boyfriend. To me, every second they wasted was a second she was drifting further away into the clutches of something unnatural. The psychological torture intensified when I tried to show them the website again, only to find that it had been professionally purged from the internet. No cache, no history, just a haunting gray 404 error page that felt like a digital tombstone. By the time December 26th arrived, I was a ghost of a man, vibrating with the exhaustion of being awake for nearly 30 hours straight, my eyes bloodshot and my mind looping the same horrific questions. Where was she? What were they doing to her? And why did the spa reminder on my phone feel less like an appointment and more like a countdown to her execution? I finally bid the authorities a sarcastic, bitter goodbye as they left without a single lead. And the moment the door closed, the silence of the house became a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that screamed her name from every empty corner, until I finally collapsed into a fitful, nightmare-ridden sleep. The police had barely been gone for an hour when the black van finally returned to my driveway. But they didn't drop off my girlfriend. They dropped off a hollow, breathing shell that looked like her, but lacked everything that made her human. My sleep was short and jagged, a fever dream of white-tiled rooms and cold, clinical voices, until a sound like thunder shattered the silence of the house, a violent, rhythmic pounding on my front door that vibrated through the floorboards and into my very teeth. I lunged out of bed, my mind screaming that she was finally home, but as I stumbled toward the door, the knocking stopped as abruptly as a heart attack, replaced by the guttural roar of a high-performance engine and the screech of tires on pavement. I looked through the peephole just in time to see a massive, matte black van with windows so dark they looked like ink stains on the world, burning rubber as it sped away, leaving a thick cloud of acrid smoke in its wake. My hands fumbled with the locks, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but when I finally swung the door open, the scream I had been holding back died in my throat, replaced by a cold, suffocating wave of horror. There, sitting in a clinical metal wheelchair on my front porch, was my girlfriend, but the person staring back at me wasn't the woman I'd spent the last 3 years with. She was dressed in a plush white robe, a pristine towel wrapped around her hair as if she had just stepped out of a sauna, yet her skin was a shade of pale that didn't look healthy. It looked artificial, like polished marble or expensive porcelain. I dropped to my knees in front of her, searching her face for a spark of recognition, but her eyes were glazed over with a milky, hollow film, staring fixedly at a point miles behind my head. Her complexion was terrifyingly perfect. Every blemish, every pore, even the tiny childhood scar on her chin had been erased, as if they had literally sanded her skin down and rebuilt it from scratch. As I reached out to touch her, my fingers brushed against her neck and my heart shattered into a million pieces when I realized her signature was gone. The birthmark she called her mark of authenticity had been removed, leaving her collarbone as blank and anonymous as a mannequin's. But the most disturbing detail was the small, square bandage taped to the center of her forehead, stained with a single, fresh drop of bright crimson blood that suggested the spa treatment had involved a drill rather than a massage. I began to shake her, screaming her name into the void of her expression, begging her to blink, to cry, to do anything other than breathe with that slow, robotic rhythm. But she only responded with a faint, guttural grunt that sounded like a machine trying to start. As I moved her in a fit of desperate grief, a small laminated card fell from the pocket of her robe and fluttered to the porch floor. A card that bore the Cerntide logo and a message so cold it felt like a death warrant. Session complete. Thank you for choosing Cerntide. We have removed the darkness. Only the vessel remains. I had spent $450 to give my girlfriend a newfound sense of life, but as I looked into her vacant, unblinking eyes, I realized that Cerntide hadn't just removed her stress, they had surgically extracted her soul, leaving me with a beautiful, breathing mannequin that didn't even know my name. The horror of the situation settled into my marrow like ice water as I sat on the porch floor clutching that clinical laminated card, while the woman I loved stared through me as if I were a ghost in her world. I tried to pull her out of the wheelchair, hoping that the familiar touch of my arms would break whatever trance they had placed her in, but her body was terrifyingly compliant, moving like a doll with no internal will to resist or assist. The most haunting part wasn't her silence, it was her perfection. Her skin felt like cold silk, devoid of the warmth and the tiny textures that made her her, and the air around her smelled faintly of ozone and expensive chemicals, a sterile scent that replaced the vanilla perfume she had worn since high school. I dragged her inside, locking the door with a dozen trembling hands, but the safety of my home felt like an illusion because the thing I was trying to protect was already gone. I spent the next few hours in a state of catatonic grief, sitting at her feet and showing her photos of our vacations, our dog, our first date, but her gaze never wavered from the wall, her pupils fixed and dilated as if she were watching a movie only she could see. Every time I looked at the bloody bandage on her forehead, I felt a surge of violent nausea, knowing that behind that gauze was the physical proof that they had reached into her mind and turned off the lights. I tried to call the police back, my voice a jagged wreck, but as I looked at my phone, I saw a final text message from an unknown number that made my heart stop. The darkness has been purged. Do not attempt to reintroduce it, or the vessel will be reclaimed. I realized then that I wasn't just living with a shell, I was living with a warning, a permanent reminder that my arrogance and my perfect gift had invited a monster into our lives that would never truly leave. I tucked her into bed that night, the same bed where we had laughed over popcorn just 48 hours ago, and as I watched her chest rise and fall in that rhythmic, hollow way, I finally understood the true cost of liberty. She was free from stress, free from pain, and free from every memory of the man who had accidentally destroyed her.